Ryan Nobles from CNN. Good morning.
Bill, how are you? Good morning. Busy night last night.
Did you? I saw the preliminary results coming out, and Roy Moore was up by, I don't know, 3 points or so. And I turned it off. I'm like, well, Ray Moore is definitely, he's going to win. And then the bulletin came across. Were you surprised?
I wasn't surprised, and I've been saying for a couple weeks now that I thought that the way that this race was going to go kind of played out the way that it did. I just thought that the kind of toxic nature that was surrounding Roy Moore's campaign was going to depress Republican vote, that just a lot of Republicans, especially in a special election that's out of the ordinary, might prevent them from going to the polls. And I thought that Democrats were going to be really enthused, particularly African-American Democrats.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened last night. You saw the reason that, Roy Moore was ahead for a good part of the night was that the more rural counties were reporting, but when those urban centers like in Birmingham and Mobile and Huntsville, when those started to come in, they came in hard and overwhelmingly for Doug Jones, way beyond the turnout numbers that we saw in previous statewide elections in Alabama, and that was evidence that the Democratic enthusiasm was through the charts, and that's the reason that there's going to be a Democratic senator in Alabama for the first time in 25 years.
And, interestingly, this is so unique because I think the Democrats, this is worth looking at the strategy. Democrats stayed very quiet during this campaign. They let all the heat go, all the troubles with Roy Moore. They let it all play out. And the opponent, Doug Jones, really kind of stayed quiet. Now, I want you to take this race, Ryan, and then look at the strategy they used with Hillary Clinton. It is a completely different strategy, and this one worked.
Well, I think you're right about that, and I do think that Doug Jones, who is a guy from Alabama, this isn't some candidate that they dragged in from some other part of the country with loose Alabama ties and had him run. This is a guy that understood the state. He wasn't running as a fire-breathing liberal. He was running as a tough prosecutor who understood the state. He certainly stuck to his core Democratic values, but I think what they did was they were very strategic in the way that they deployed the people that were supporting him. They weren't shouting from the rooftops that he had the support of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and they waited until the last week of the campaign to deploy people like Cory Booker from New Jersey and Deval Patrick from Massachusetts, and even President Obama, who did a robocall on Monday before the election. They waited until the very last moment and put them in very targeted and strategic areas to attempt to get out the African-American vote. And for the most part, they just allowed the Roy Moore campaign to implode and allowed him to continue to dig himself a deeper and deeper grave, which they seem to do with every single media appearance, every single speech. And while Doug Jones was out knocking on doors and shaking hands and bringing in people like Charles Barkley, who's a native son of Alabama and someone who's loved there, Roy Jones was in Philadelphia for the Army-Navy game. Roy Moore was in Philadelphia for the Army-Navy game. So I think that they underestimated how well the Jones campaign was doing, and the results were what the results were.
What do you think? What does it say to Steve Bannon? And you got to think that if you're Steve Bannon, you're going to come out of this and say, listen, we almost won, but we had the entire nation coming at this guy with these lies and these terrible things. It's no surprise. But is this is certainly a loss for Steve Bannon? Oh,
well, I mean, that you hit Steve Bannon's spin right on that. You hit the nail right on the head. That this was a grand conspiracy. The media and everyone was out to get them. Just another example of how the establishment doesn't care about the average person in Alabama. But let's look at the facts here, Bill. This is a state that a Democrat has not won in 25 years.
Yeah.
Both Mitt Romney and Donald Trump won this state by almost 20 points. It went from a state that Republicans could easily win by double-digit margins to a state that they lost. And Steve Bannon was the architect of that turnaround. So the favorite strategists of Democrats this morning should be Steve Bannon. They should hope that Steve Bannon goes into every competitive Senate race in the country and deploys the same tactics that he used in Alabama, because if they do that, the Democrats will have control of the Senate in 2018.
Yeah.
Well, not every Republican candidate is going to be a accused child molester either.
No, they're not. But Steve Bannon that was the horse that Steve Bannon picked from the very beginning. That's who he picked in the primary.
That's been a criticism of Bannon, is he's not vetted his candidates at all.
Yeah, right. They're not all going to be accused child molesters, Andrew, but when you look at the candidates that he is picking in other places, in Arizona, in Utah, and in places like that, they're not necessarily Roy Moore candidates, but they're of that ilk. He's looking for these kind of burn down the house type of candidates who all have, in certain respects, some sort of a checkered past. He might back somebody like Joe Arpaio, who had to be pardoned by Donald Trump to stay out of jail in Arizona. So, and it's not just the type of candidates he's backing; it's the strategy in which he uses these candidates and essentially has them double down on their most controversial aspects of their background. And, that worked with Donald Trump. I don't think the country was necessarily paying as close attention to politics as they are now. We thought this was the case in Virginia and New Jersey, that the Democratic Party has woken up. They're not going to allow this to happen to them again. The fact that Republicans lose a race in Alabama is evidence that the Democratic Party has woken up. And let me just make this point too, Andrew. Yeah, Roy Moore may be the most extreme candidate, but Alabama is the fifth most conservative state in the country. If you can't win Alabama, where else are you going to win?
I got to tell you, yesterday, I just felt there was no way in the world that Doug Jones could win because it is so far right in Alabama. I just didn't think there was any chance. But a lot of Republicans voted for Doug Jones. A lot of Republicans.
Or just stayed home.
Or wrote in some name. There was a lot of that, too.
There were 22,000 write-in votes last night.
Wow.
22,000.
That's crazy.
And if you look at the margin of error, it was, I don't know what the numbers are this morning as they continue to count votes, but it was like 1.7%, and the write-in vote was about 1.6% of the vote total. It was almost exactly the margin of victory for Doug Jones. But I think the important thing to point out here, Bill, is that, I think, and I kind of feel bad for the state of Alabama. The last, month and a half, they've been shamed, and people have said they're nothing but a bunch of racist rednecks and bigots who don't know any better. And there were a lot of Americans that were ready to just kind of cut Alabama off from the rest of the country. And what they showed last night was that there are just as many responsible people in this country who can look at this race objectively and make a decision that they think is best for their country. Yeah. So this idea that Alabama is just a state full of rubes is not true. They were most of the people that voted there voted for thoughtful reasons. Even if they voted for Roy Moore, they had some sort of explanation. Yeah. And at the end of the day, they picked a candidate they feel can best represent their country. And I still think that this democracy thing that we've created, that our founding fathers created more than 200 years ago, it still works. And I think that we should give voters credit and give voters the opportunity to make those decisions.
I was just going to say I'm glad the Republicans lost that, because I think it would have been a black eye on the party and the national discussion going forward.
The mess of trying to do the ethics investigation and all of that, the mess they would have dealt with.
There's a lot.
Brutal.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation in Washington over the past couple of weeks, like what's the best case scenario for Republicans in this race. And, I think there were many Republicans, particularly Republicans in the Senate, that couldn't really decide, and mainly because the margin of error in the Senate right now is so tight. So they've lost a vote here. And you saw the tactic last night by the National Republican Senate Campaign Committee and Cory Gardner from Colorado. And he said last night, he suggested that Doug Jones vote with the Senate Republicans, that he should follow the will of Alabama voters and essentially caucus with the Republicans. Now, I doubt it'll go that far, but I do think you're going to have to look at Doug Jones as not necessarily being a rubber stamp for Chuck Schumer. Yeah. He might be more in the Joe Manchin mode of West Virginia, where he's going to pick and choose issues where he may side with Republicans. And I think, when you've got people that come from the opposing parties from states that might lean in the other direction, they sometimes make the best members of Congress, because they truly have to look at these issues from both sides. Well, and they end up being really important voices in these discussions.
I think we said earlier, a Democrat in Alabama is much different than a Democrat in New York City. You're talking about somebody who's probably far more moderate and is going to have to be in order to survive quickly. Andrew.
Well, and I think the last Democratic senator in Alabama actually ended up changing parties. It was, to your point, Ryan, about it being the most fifth
it was
most
Richard
conservative.
Shelby, the guy that's still there. Yeah.
He just changed parties.
Okay, what is 51? I mean, still though, 51-49. It puts into question at the very least. Because you don't know where Doug Jones is going to go. And the other thing that you cannot ignore is Doug Jones ain't there without the DNC. So what does he owe to the Democrats?
Right, exactly. It's not as if he's going to come in there and just all of a sudden vote like a Republican.
Right.
He does owe, they spent more than $20 million with national Democratic money that came into that race. So it's not as if he's just going to go up there and all of a sudden become a Republican. But the most early and urgent concern that Republicans have is their tax reform bill, right? So that's already in a conference committee. They hope to vote on it sometime this week. Now, that is not going to impact Doug Jones at all because it's going to take at least until the 26th of December for Alabama to officially certify the results of the election. So he can't be seated until after that certification, which likely means, because they will be out of session over the Christmas holiday, that he won't be seated until the beginning of the new year. So if you're Mitch McConnell right now, the urgency at which you have to get this tax reform bill done and done now is imperative. Because if you lose the Alabama vote and Doug Jones becomes an arbiter in this, it goes into the new year, the whole thing could be thrown into a tailspin. So that's the first thing. But then, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, has been talking about Medicaid reform and Social Security and entitlement reform. They want to talk about an infrastructure bill. All these things now become much more difficult for the Republicans in the Senate because they don't have that two-vote cushion that they once had.
Ryan Nobles, CNN. We appreciate it as always, Ryan. We'll talk again next week, and have a great week.
You too. Have a great week, guys.
Ryan Nobles.